Hi, I'm Ashley with Campbell. Thanks for investing your time to help your community be a great place to live. Before you watch the video, make sure to click the subscribe button so that we can help you make educated decisions as a board member.
All right, I guess my turn. Thanks, Ashley. Let me make sure that this comes through. If you can just give me a confirmation you're able to see my screen at this point.
I see it.
Excellent. Okay, great. All right. Well, good afternoon, I guess we're at, everybody. Thanks for joining us. My name is Will Simons here from Association Reserves. I'm going to be sharing my content here in just a moment. Let me go ahead and click through just to make sure we're advancing properly. Well, first of all, thank you, Ashley, everybody at Campbell. Thanks for the opportunity to put this on. We've been doing these webinars with you guys now for a few years at least, and always appreciate the great turnout, great participation. I expect we have a lot of CAMs, but also a lot of board members. So everybody out there, welcome. Today's class is going to be a really good overview of some very important concepts with regard to reserve funding. The first part is going to be a little bit of a philosophical exercise, if you will, talking about why reserves are important in the first place. And then the second half, maybe 2/3 of the course, is going to be a deeper dive into actual methodologies, kind of the nuts and bolts of how you fund reserves using the two primary industry methods. So look forward to that. I think Ashley already did all the housekeeping announcements that I normally do. So yeah, don't worry about sending in your CAM license. Don't worry about the recording, the slides, all of that is already taken care of, and we will be sending all of that out to you guys. So I'm going to turn my camera off here in just a moment, but before I do that, just wanted to give everybody kind of a sense of the timeline for today. Usually this class goes for about 50 minutes. I'm going to try to cut that down to about 45 today. I'm expecting there will be a lot of questions. We do have a pretty good size audience. So I want to allow plenty of time for that. I do have a hard stop at 1:15, so I'm hoping we'll get at least 20, 30 minutes of Q&A time. But as we go through the class, this is your opportunity to ask questions. So as we go along, please use that Zoom taskbar. Go ahead, submit questions. And when we get to the end of the class content, I'll be going through those and answering those live. So I guess without further ado, I will kill my video for the moment, and I will see you on screen later. But for now, please enjoy the course. Thank you. All right. So just to introduce myself and our company in a little bit more detail. Again, my name is Will Simons. I'm the president of the Florida office for our company, Association Reserves. I've been with the company since 2008. So going on, what's that make, 17 years now. I've completed or overseen more than 3,000 reserve studies in my career. I think I probably need to update that number now based on the last couple of years. I think it's a little bit more than that, but I've been doing this quite a long time. The RS after my name stands for Reserve Specialist. That's an industry-specific credential that is only awarded to people who have demonstrated their experience and expertise in preparing reserve studies. That designation comes from CAI. I'm sure a lot of you are at least familiar with, if not members of CAI, the Community Associations Institute. I've lived in both condos and HOAs, just kind of on the personal side. I spent about 6 years serving as the treasurer of my own HOA in South Florida. We had a budget there of a little over $1 million, about 635 homes in our neighborhood. And the reason I always like to point that out is because I do know what it's like to be on the other side of the table. Okay, I know especially for you board members out there, this can be a very difficult, very thankless job. And so I want to salute you guys for the time that you put in, the commitment you make to your communities, doing what you can to try and make life better for your fellow owners, your fellow residents. So thank you. I guess just by way of housekeeping too, one other thing I wanted to mention, just because I'm anticipating that there will probably be a lot of people here today that have questions about SIRS, the Structural Integrity Reserve Studies. Everything that I speak about today is relevant to that, but I'm not going to do a very deep dive on the legislation itself. That may be something we can tackle during the Q&A. But I do plan on having a specific webinar, hopefully something we can coordinate with Campbell later this spring, to do a much more thorough overview about the requirements, how those might have changed in the next couple of months, the Florida legislature is going to be getting back into regular session in March. So we're kind of in a holding pattern right now, waiting to see what might change between now and then or what changes to the legislation they may propose. But I just wanted to get that out early, that if any of you out there had very specific technical questions about Senate Bill 154 or milestone inspections or structural integrity reserve studies, this content that I talked about today is still going to be very useful for you, but it's not going to be specifically talking about those requirements. Again, that may be, if we have time and a lot of people are asking about it, something I address in the Q&A. But for the moment, let me tell you a little bit more about our company. So we are the oldest and largest reserve study provider in the US. We've been in business since 1986, and we've completed tens of thousands of reserve studies for all different types of properties all around the world. In fact, our projection is that by the end of 2025, maybe early 2026, I think we will have crossed over 100,000 reserve studies in our company's history. So pretty big number. We're very excited about that. Including myself, we have a total of 28 people on our Florida staff. That represents a very wide variety of technical backgrounds, such as engineering, architecture, construction management, but also business and accounting. As of now, 10 of us have earned the RS, the Reserve Specialist credential. And as of early part of this year, we're expecting to add a few more reserve specialists to our roster. So again, excited about that too. The majority of the work that we do is for community associations, which includes all types of condos, HOAs, but also timeshares and other types of residential properties. If you're interested, we do also have a lot of experience with other property types, things like office buildings, hotels, resorts, country clubs, worship facilities, golf courses, and so on. We've been very fortunate to be recognized by the Florida Community Association Journal. We are a Reader's Choice Award winner going back the last 12 years in a row. So a nice feather in our cap. And for those that have voted for us in the past, thank you very much for that. So one thing I always like to point out in these webinars is that this is our only job, right? We only do reserve studies and now the structural integrity reserve studies. We are not an engineering firm. We're not an accounting firm. We have no interest in trying to win a management contract. We're not looking to take on a construction project for you. We are a very specialized consulting firm, and we're focused on doing this one thing really well, which is to guide our clients towards a successful financial future. The way that we do that is by preparing accurate, reliable reserve studies that help those clients to forecast and budget for major projects. So if we do our job well and our clients follow those plans that we design for them, hopefully the benefit of all of that is they can reduce the risk of special assessments and having to rely on bank loans, any other types of financial distress that could be avoided. So if you'd like any additional information, I'll give you our website now, is www.reservestudy.com. I will have my email address up on screen towards the end, but if you want to write it down now, my email address is wsimons, that's WSIMONS @reservestudy.com. All right, so as I mentioned before, this class really just has two sections. The first section is going to focus on the philosophy or the reasoning behind why it's important to have reserves at all. Okay, in other words, why is it not okay for associations to just pass a special assessment or go out and get a loan every time they have some big project? If you've attended any of our prior courses, you might have seen we have another class called Fundamentals of Reserves. And in that class, I talk a lot about this concept of percent funded, which is kind of this way of measuring the relative strength of an association's reserve fund at any point in time. So if you're not sure what that means, I would encourage you to go on our website, maybe find a recording of one of those prior classes. We do have a lot of material talking about percent funded, and it is something that I'm going to touch on towards the end of today's class. So, but either way, whether or not this is the first time you're hearing this, or if it's something you've been doing for many, many years, my goal is for you all to leave today with a better grasp, a better understanding of kind of the basic underlying principle, and then very specifically get a good feel for the two different methodologies, what we call the pooled method and the straight line method for funding reserves. All right, so let's start with the basics. Okay, why have reserves? All right, and I like to frame this question in this kind of hypothetical manner. So what are reserves for? Okay, why do associations collect them? And one way you could look at this, do we think that reserve funding is important in the here and now, or is it for the future? Okay, so cue the Jeopardy music in your brain for a moment. I'll give you a couple seconds to think about that. Okay. So if you are thinking that reserves are for the future, you're not alone. But I think it's a very important point to make, and I want to really drive this home early, that reserve funding takes place and is for the here and now. Okay. I think it's a misunderstanding to think of reserve funding as saving up for a future project. The reason why I don't like that approach is because oftentimes there's a very good chance that the owners who live in your association now won't be there by the time that project takes place, right? So it makes sense to them that maybe they shouldn't be funding reserves because they're thinking it's all for some project that they will not be around to benefit from. But I want to encourage you to think of this in a different way, okay? If you think of reserve funding as paying the current bill of deterioration, right? Imagine an invoice coming to your association every month that showed the rate of deterioration for the roof that month, for example. That's the more appropriate way to think of it. It's like this kind of pay-as-you-go model. Okay, so if you've seen this class before, this is actually a new slide. I added this one just this week because I really want to make this point more clear. So in order to illustrate this concept of why reserve funding is for the present day, I want to show you this table. This is something that we include in all of our reserve studies. Now, the second column from the right, okay, the one that says deterioration cost per year, okay, that is intended to show the typical annual cost of deterioration for each component in this analysis. Okay, the way the cost is calculated is pretty simple. We take the current cost estimate for that thing and we divide by its useful life. So for example, if we look at the last row in the top section, labeled site and grounds, where I've drawn this red box here, we're looking at one component of this reserve funding plan. And it's a landscaping refurbishment allowance, okay? So in this example, the current cost of the landscaping is $100,000, right? It's 100 grand every 20 years. That's the useful life there of 20 years. So $100,000 divided by 20 years gives us a theoretical annual deterioration cost of $5,000. Okay, 100 divided by 20 equals 5. The takeaway here then is that this association should be funding reserves in the amount of something like $5,000 each year just to keep pace with that rate of deterioration, to offset it, if you will, right? So they're only spending money on landscaping in this study every 20 years, but that doesn't mean they should be collecting 100 grand every 20th year to pay for it all, right? You could very easily say that something like 5 grand a year goes away. If you imagine an imaginary bill coming to the association for that amount, you pay that bill by funding your reserve account. Now notice this table does not have any remaining useful life estimates showing, and that's by design. We want to emphasize that deterioration happens all the time, right? It's not just in one particular year. So we want them to think of paying this reserve funding bill, this deterioration bill, as they go along, not waiting until the end of each component's lifespan and then expecting to pay the full amount all at once, right? That's what we call a special assessment. So again, the whole point of reserve funding is that it never stops. Each year, you offset the rate of deterioration of each component by paying the total combined cost for all of those deterioration rates added together. Okay, so if I look at the bottom of this column here, we can see that the total annual cost of deterioration adds up to about $280,000 in this case. Okay, so even in years where there's no spending, right? You can imagine this is a brand new community. There's nothing on the near-term horizon. They're still experiencing deterioration in a measurable fashion, something like 280 grand a year. Now, I want to also point out that's not static, right? That will typically increase over time due to inflation, right? Every time we would update the current cost estimates in this study, that then affects the annual deterioration rate. So at this point in time, they should think of their burn rate, their deterioration rate as something like 280 grand. but they shouldn't be surprised that that number is going up over time as well. Okay, so in our business, we like to talk about these 4 kind of reserve rules, right? The first one is that the expenses are inevitable. Okay, there is no getting around the fact that air conditioning systems need to be replaced, elevators need to be modernized, roads need to be repaved, right? That's just fact of life. Number 2, the board, meaning the board of directors, is responsible. They are the ones entrusted with managing the community association on behalf of all of the owners. The third rule here, when projects get delayed, they tend to get more expensive. I'm sure some of you can relate to this. We see it all the time. If you're talking about something like a roof or a concrete restoration project, anything to do with the building envelope, protecting it from the elements. When you delay those things and they continue to fail, you're talking about their higher risks of deeper work, more in-depth structural issues, right? In the case of concrete, for example. Now, the last rule here, most importantly, I think, is that the homeowners always get stuck paying the bill, right? There's been talk in the last couple of years about what the government might do to create, loan programs and funds, and I would not put any faith in that, right? There's probably going to be no Uncle Sam, no government bailout coming for community associations that don't have adequate reserve funds. Okay, just like there are those 4 rules for reserve planning, there are only 4 options for how to eventually pay these bills. Now, the first and best option, of course, we would say is to have a healthy reserve fund. The second best option is to pass special assessments when projects come along. Now, it should be obvious that's kind of a bad situation when the second best option has that skull and crossbones warning on it. Now, the reason I chose that, and maybe you can relate to this if you've managed a community or lived in one that has recurring special assessments, you know that that's a toxic thing for communities to go through, right? This is what happens to when board members get, thrown out, right? A new board comes into play, when management companies get let go, when there's turmoil in the community, right? Oftentimes that's following a special assessment. The next best option would be to take out a loan or a line of credit to pay for these projects. Now, the reason I have that one ranked behind or after a special assessment is because, of course, the cost is greater because of the cost of the financing element to the project. Now, what happens if you don't do any of those 3? Okay, well, nature's going to take its course, right? Your property will fall into disrepair. And if there's been no money put aside or collected or available in any format for paying for that, then those same owners are going to pay for the rate of deterioration in the form of a declining property value, right? You can easily imagine that you've got lots and lots of older buildings in Florida that have not been keeping pace with that deterioration over time. And those buildings, unfortunately, are suffering now. They are not finding that their property value is as strong as it should be in the marketplace. Okay, I wanted to articulate some of the specific benefits here of that first option of having a reserve fund. So starting from the top, and we'll go clockwise here, you shouldn't have any surprises, or at least a very low chance of getting caught by surprise. If you are funding your reserves and you're paying attention, right? You're doing a reserve study, you're paying attention to the stuff with your board, your management company, your CPA, you are tracking the remaining life expectancies of your components. You have a good feel for what is coming due soon. And when you do that, that gives you the option to plan ahead and prepare for those things when they need to be replaced, rather than reacting and getting caught by surprise only when something fails. When you're planning ahead like this, that also gives you the chance to shop around, right? You're going to come up and be able to interview different companies, put together a nice bid package, go out to bid to 5 or 10 different companies if you want. Right? Having that time on your side gives you the ability to get more options on the table and possibly even to minimize the cost, right? If you can work with your contractor, let's say it's a painting company, and you might ask them, hey, look, do you guys have a slow season? When is the best time of the year to have our building painted? Maybe they can cut you a little bit better price if you're willing to work with them on something like that. Now, on the flip side, if you are reacting, you're getting caught by surprise when something breaks, right? Let's say it's the 4th of July weekend and the cooling tower and the building just went down and now you have no air conditioning, right? That's an emergency, right? You have to get somebody out there right away to fix it. And when you're doing that, when you're rushing, you're probably going to pay a higher fee because you don't have any other option. The point on the screen, the bottom of the screen here about minimizing exposure, I would say that's mostly relevant to the board members out there. What I mean by that is that if you are proactively taking care of the property, you are doing a better job of upholding your fiduciary duty. And I would argue that might give you better protection against any potential complaints or lawsuits even from the owners. Now we can tie all that together, right? The last point is that if you are doing all of these three things, hopefully that naturally leads to increasing property values, right? In our experience, the communities that are doing a good job of reserve funding tend to have better curb appeal. They're more up to date with respect to technology. Their amenities are more modern than the ones that don't, right? And all of that then contributes to a better ownership experience for the people who live there now, which in turn makes those units more attractive to potential buyers. Okay, so those are all the positives. Now, the opposites, you could argue, would be true if you don't have a healthy reserve fund. Okay, you are more exposed to surprises, which can lead to higher expenses, more liability exposure, and possibly, in the worst cases, even declining property values. Now, the real issue I've always seen is that when communities get into this kind of vicious cycle, it becomes increasingly more difficult to get out of it. Okay, so that was a pretty brief tour of kind of the philosophy, why having reserves is important. Obviously, I know this is a very popular hot button issue right now, right? We're seeing a lot of newspaper articles, we're seeing TV interviews, we're seeing, kind of these public arguments even between the governor and the legislature about how to give assistance to community associations. We are totally sensitive to all of that. But everything I just talked about would have been true whether we ever had Champlain Towers South and that tragedy or not, right? Mother Nature and Father Time are the underlying drivers behind the need for reserve funding. And those have always been there and always will be here, right? So I know there's a lot of consternation, a lot of anxiety right now in the marketplace about the cost of living, the cost of being in an association. And the one point I've been trying to reiterate is that, to my view, the cost of living in a condo association has not increased as a result of the CERS laws, okay? Whether or not we had this new legislation, whether or not that tower ever collapsed, all of the owners and all of these buildings would still be expected to pay for the same things at about the same times, right? Every roof would have been due for replacement. Every concrete restoration job would have happened. Every elevator modernization project would have happened. So if it weren't for these new laws mandating reserve funding, what would have been the options? The same exact people would have been asked to take out a loan or pay a special assessment or kick the can down the road and suffer declining property values. So that one screen about the four options being the only options on the table, none of that has changed. The only thing that I think has happened now is that the government has stepped in and really focused the attention on the need for reserve funding. And I think has done a very good service to the state of Florida by telling associations, we're not going to let you shoot yourselves in the foot anymore. Okay, you cannot waive reserves for these critical elements because they are inevitable, they will happen, and you need to be prepared for that. So I know it's been a bumpy ride and probably will continue to be, but I just wanted to give that kind of 30,000-foot view for anybody out there who's maybe feeling like this is unfair or the government should not have done this. I think it was actually much overdue that the associations out there in Florida have been, waiving reserves for far too long, and this is a step in the right direction. So may not be the most popular opinion, but I think we have the math and the experience to back that up. Okay, I'll get off my soapbox now. So for the second part of this class, I think maybe the more technical part, and I think what some of you may be more interested to hear, I'm going to talk about the two different ways that associations calculate reserve funding. What we call the straight line method is the one I'm going to look at first. So the other term for this method people might have heard is called the component method. And the reason for that is that in this scenario, all components are treated separately from a funding standpoint. I've always characterized this as kind of the old-fashioned way. More and more communities have switched to pooled reserves, and generally they're very happy they did that. But part of the reason this method is the old-fashioned way, in my terminology, is that because prior to the year 2002, so more than 20 years ago, at least in the state of Florida, this was the only option. okay? Associations were not allowed to pool their reserves before that timeline. So if you're in a condo that was built prior to 2002, your entire history may have been using this method, but I'm hoping by the end of this class, you'll appreciate that there's probably a little bit better way to do it. So the way I've characterized this straight line or component method is that it's simple in theory, right? It's pretty straightforward back of the envelope calculations, but the practical application of it becomes very messy, and I can show you why. First thing we're going to do is just properly understand how it works. Okay, so if you want to understand this method, I think it's very helpful for you to think of each category or each single line item of your reserves as being funded in a separate bucket of money. Okay, so for now, let's assume we're talking about these as our 5 buckets, right? We have the roof, elevator, painting, mechanical, and pavement. These are the 5 things that we're funding for. When you're using this method, you determine the amount of funding going into each account, into each bucket, using a very simple calculation. Basically, you take the cost of the component, you subtract out any existing money that you've already saved for it, whatever the difference is, you take that remaining difference and you divide it by the remaining useful life, the RUL, for that component. And the result of that calculation will then tell you the amount required to quote unquote fully fund it in the following year's budget. Okay. So let's use our roof reserve, our roof bucket as our first example. So if you understand the total volume of the bucket being the total cost to replace the roof, and if we say that our existing reserve money is the contents of the bucket, the empty portion, okay, the difference here is something we might call the unfunded balance, right? It's just the difference between the total cost minus the existing money already saved up. So let's attach some numbers to this, okay? Let's say that the cost of our roof is $200,000 and we already have 140 grand in the bank. The unfunded balance then, the difference is $60,000. So if I'm going to sit down at budget time and I need to determine how much I need to be funding my roof reserve account going forward, I need to apply these numbers. I'll take the $200,000 cost, subtract the 140, I get that $60,000 difference. Now, let's say I've determined, or that my reserve study has determined, the remaining life of my roof is 3 years. So I'll take 200 minus 140, I get $60,000 divided by 3 means I am now putting 20 grand a year for these next 3 years into my roof reserve in order to fully fund that account. Okay. I move on, right? I complete that process for each of the remaining buckets. And that's how I go about doing my budget. Now, as you can see this playing out over time, you can imagine how you might end up with a variety of different funding positions, right? And that's dependent on how accurate your assumptions were for things like life expectancies and costs. In reality, some components may be very well funded while others are not. In our view, this makes for an inefficient distribution of all of the association's actual reserve money. To say that differently, money might be locked up in one account when it would really be very advantageous to move it over to some other project, maybe that's a higher priority, but I can't do that. And that's where things start to get very complicated. Okay, some of the problems specifically that we identify with this method. First of all, it's very often the case that there is no prior reserve fund, right? We see this all the time. We'll come out to a building, we get a copy of their balance sheet, and they've got 6 or 8 line items for reserves, and we hand over a reserve study that has 75 components. They don't always fit with what has been done now, right? Sometimes that means the funds are too broadly defined, right? In my example, I had this one combined account that I called mechanical. And in theory, that's supposed to capture everything from security cameras to fire alarms to cooling towers. The problem is all of those have very different life expectancies and very different costs. And when I just mix them all together into one broad category, now I'm having to unwind that. I have to figure out some very complicated math to determine how much money needs to go into the account in total when it's spread across all these various things. For you managers out there, maybe you'll appreciate this. We always think that the component method is much more of a headache. Why is that? Well, because under this method, the statutes require that your owners have to vote to approve the moving of funds from one place to another. So in my example, if I wanted to take money from the elevator reserves and move it to the pavement reserves, I have to have the owners vote to do that. Now, anybody who's been around associations probably knows getting a quorum for anything is very difficult. But especially so, I think, when it comes to moving money around, right? Your residents might be very skeptical, hesitant to give that approval unless they fully understand why. That means the board, the manager are calling special meetings, sending tons of emails and notices. They're getting their attorneys involved. It's a logistical headache. Now, lastly, and I think probably the most serious issue with this method is that because it's more conservative and associations are not making the most efficient use of the sum total of all of their reserve money, it ends up costing the owners in these communities more money out of pocket to fund their reserves this way. So just to give you some context, every year we have many, many clients, about a third of our clients that are still using straight line reserves. When we do their studies, we give them both recommendations. We show them what happens if they stay with that straight line method, and then we show them what could happen if they pooled their reserves together, which we'll talk about more in a moment. But we want to show them the difference between the two. And every time we do this very reliably, we find significant differences in the recommendations based on which method they choose. On average, the difference is about 200% higher for communities to use the straight line method. Okay, I'll say that again. That means triple the amount of reserve funding from the owners to do this using the straight line method than the pooled method. Okay, and again, we're talking about the same underlying list of components. There is no difference at all between what is included, how long the life expectancies are, and what these things cost. It is purely the accounting side of a reserve study, where if you're funding these things in these, conservative buckets and not pooling the money together, that's when it causes the higher need for ongoing cash, right? So if you're in a community out there, and I'm sure every single one of you are, where you're trying to cut costs, trying to keep your assessments from going too high, one of the best ways you can do that is to pool your reserves. Okay, so this option I've been talking about, the pooled method, another term for it is called the cash flow method. And in our opinion, and I think I probably speak for really our whole industry here, this is not just me or my company, but anybody who understands the differences here, this is the better way to go. So again, it's only been approved in Florida since 2002, but because we're a national company, right, we have 16 offices throughout the US, our Florida office is the only one that still has any clients using straight line. Everywhere else went to pooled decades ago and has never looked back. And it's not even a question, okay? So the difference here, I think you could argue, is that the pooled method maybe is more complex in theory, but once you get the hang of it, much, much simpler to use for budgeting. Okay, before we talk about the methodology, in case I've piqued your interest already, right? One of the most common questions we get about this is, well, okay, I'm sold. How do we do that, right? If we have straight line now, but we're interested to switch to pooled, what's the process? So I added this slide to go through that. So first and foremost, I wanted to make it clear, the board of directors can create a pooled reserve account all by itself. A board, to make that more clear, can say, as of let's say our next fiscal year, all new incoming reserve money is going into a pooled reserve fund. That itself does not require the owners to vote. Okay, it is only if the board wants to move money from the existing straight line accounts, the bucket, okay, into the pooled fund. That's when the owners have to vote and approve it. The reason behind that is it's considered a non-scheduled use of those funds. So it's the same voting process required as if you were moving money from painting reserves to elevator reserves, okay? The act of taking money from a straight line and putting it into a pool requires the owners to vote, but that's only for cash you already have. Again, the board can decide for any new money we're going to collect, that goes straight into the pool, right? There's no middleman there. Now, the good news is that the act of pooling the reserves is a one-time process, right? They don't have to take that vote every year when you adopt your budget. So if you are curious about this, I would highly recommend that you involve your association CPA, maybe your attorney. If you've got a reserve study company you work with, they can certainly help you out with that. But this is a good thing to do, right? If you're on the fence and you're concerned about increasing assessments and your reserves are still straight line, highly, highly recommend looking into the pooled method. So how does it work? Okay, so the best way that I found to explain this process is to go back to that same bucket analogy, right? Only now I'm going to take all of my buckets of money, I'm going to dump all that cash into one big bathtub, okay? Just imagine that actually happening. And I take a big, a big spoon or something and stir it all around. The act of doing that has removed these labels, right? Now I don't have roof reserves as distinguished from painting reserves. I just have reserve money that is collectively available for anything on my reserve schedule. Okay, so I still have a listing of components that define what is a reserve item or not, but I'm not further distinguishing it beyond that. Okay, there's no such thing anymore as roof reserves or painting or elevator. It is all one big pot of money that can be spent a lot more effectively and efficiently. Okay, the very first step of doing this is exactly the same as if you're doing straight line. What I mean there is that the foundation of any reserve planning has to be an accurate component list, right? It doesn't matter which method you're going to use for the accounting side if the physical data is not reliable. Okay, so let's take for granted that you have an accurate list of components, all of the life expectancies, all of the cost estimates are good and solid. The next thing you can do is apply those numbers and put together a timeline of expenses. Okay, so most reserve studies are going to include something like this. This is a 30-year forecast where we're showing this client when you're going to spend money, right? And again, that's driven by the underlying remaining life expectancies and costs for these projects. So this is, let's say this is 2024. Here we would have been in the present day projecting that about 10 years from now, okay, you're going to have a bunch of components that are going to come due. So as of now, the remaining life expectancies would show 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, right? We count all the way down to here. So we're planning for 10 years out from now on this big expenditure. Once we know what those future expenditures will look like, the next step is to determine how much money needs to go into the reserve account in order to meet those expenses. Now, I think it's a fairly straightforward process, but let me walk you through the steps. The very first thing to do is to determine the sum total of the reserve fund at the start of the fiscal year, right? How much money is in the pool? Step 2 is to plug in an estimated income, right? An estimated funding amount to that account, which can be a combination of money collected from the owners, but also interest paid by the bank. So again, here is a nice advantage we already have over straight line, which has no future consideration as part of it, right? The straight line method looks at one fiscal year at a time. When you're looking at 30 years at a time, you can make some really good headway by factoring in interest earnings, which will contribute towards your cash balance. Okay, my next step is to go back to my forecast and see what costs are coming up on the schedule. From there, I'm going to do the math. I'll take my starting total cash position. I will add in my money going into reserves. I will subtract out my money projected to go out of reserves, and I will see where that account balance leaves me going into the next year. I look at year 2, right? I look at the start of that next year. Obviously, I need to make sure that I have some money left over. If not, I go back a couple steps. I need to plug in a higher income amount, a higher contribution or higher funding amount of reserves, because I simply cannot design a plan that will have me going below 0, right? We'll talk about that in just a moment. Now, I know this sounds a little complicated, but if you set this up with an Excel spreadsheet or some other type of software, it's very easy to very quickly model out many, many years of reserve funding, cash in and cash out at a time. And when I do that, I can see how that reserve account balance fluctuates over those years, with my goal being to keep it at a safe level. Which leads me to an important point. Okay, there are certainly differences of opinion over what is considered to be a safe or a healthy amount of reserve funding. Basically, our industry has consolidated these to 3 funding objectives, what we call baseline funding, which is the minimum requirement in Florida to at least do the baseline. There's full funding, okay, which is setting a target to become 100% funded, which is a different concept. And then there's threshold funding. And I'm going to talk about each one in that order. So baseline funding, okay, this is the riskiest option on the table. Now, again, I said it's perfectly legal to do this in Florida, but for most communities out there, this is not a great idea. The objective when you're using this method is you figure out what is the bare minimum. How much do I need to put into reserves on an ongoing basis so that I never go out, all right? I never completely run dry. That is allowable, but I want to make sure you understand how risky that is. And here's the other problem with this. When we talk just with our clients, with managers, even with accountants and attorneys, there's, to me, a disconnect in the terminology here. This is something we're actively looking to try and fix with Florida legislators, is that what does fully funding mean? Okay, now if you talk to most people in Florida and you ask them what they mean by fully funding a pooled reserve account, what they will describe to you is what I'm going to now tell you should be called baseline funding, right? This is not my term. This comes from CAI. It's been around since the late 90s. It's the minimum required by law unless you get a vote of the owners to approve something less than that. Now, to be clear, that vote of the owners to do less than baseline has now gone away for structural components, which, again, it's not really the subject of today's class, but for those of you out there worried about structural integrity studies, you cannot even vote to do less than baseline now. Basically, in other words, what you want to know, what is the amount that we need to put into the budget each year so that our owners can't or won't vote against it? And the law says that that amount, that number that needs to go into the budget to avoid that process, is the amount that would be required to keep a positive cash balance over time. And anything above 0 is considered acceptable. This is the actual language that comes from Florida legislation when you're talking about pooled reserves. Okay, it basically says that the contribution rate needs to be enough so that over time, your cash inflows are greater than your cash outflows in the totality of the analysis. But that's it. Okay, there's no other requirement to go along with it. If you want to take the time to go and read this legislation more carefully, you'll probably find the term fully funding is actually not used anywhere with respect to the pooled method. The closest thing I could find is the term sufficient funds. In fact, the DBPR has a manual that they've published, which is a guide used by managers and boards, which explains how to design a pooled funding calculation. Now, in the example in their official manual, the association that they're using gets to a point where they have $4 in their reserve account, and the state labels this in their official publication as sufficient. Now, before I go on, rhetorical question, does anybody out there think that it's ever a good idea for any association to have $4 in their reserve account? Hopefully you agree that's a very dangerous approach to take. That means if you're doing the bare minimum and that's your target, it only takes one thing going wrong to completely blow up that plan, right? That could be some project happening a little earlier than you thought or costing a little bit more than you thought. The point is, if you're trying to thread the needle that closely, there's no margin for error, okay? In that scenario, the chances you'll need a special assessment or a loan become very, very high. So if one of our main reasons of going through this process at all is to try and prevent that from happening, I would argue that that is a very dangerous strategy. Okay, if you look at this table, this is a kind of a snapshot from one of our studies. This is a real world example of what baseline funding looks like. Okay, so if I start here in the top left corner, my first year of the analysis, this association starting with about 1.1 million in reserve funding. At that point in time, their theoretical center of the bullseye, their fully funded balance is about 1.2. So they're really good. They're 90% funded. But if their goal is to just do the minimum, right, to baseline fund reserves over time, we run this calculation out. Okay, how much do you need so that as you expending money, you still stay above 0? Now we got down to this low point of $110, right? So in this example, they're starting from a position of strength. They're putting away just enough money in reserve funding plus interest income so that as they spend it, right, these reserve expenditures on the right, cash in and cash out yields a low point of $110. Now, to me, this would be a pretty lousy scenario, right? You're going from a place where you have 7 figures in the bank down to 3 figures in the bank. Not a good idea, okay? Let's look at this a different way. Now, again, just to reiterate, the state of Florida would approve this. They would say this is sufficient. This is adequate. No big deal. I would argue this is not the way this association should be going, right? They're going from a strong position, getting down to a very weak one, and really never recovering. They're never getting back up into the strong range of percent funded. So that's one option. The next option I'm going to talk about is the other end of the spectrum, the more conservative option, what we call full funding or fully funding the reserves. Now, I want to be really careful here. You're hearing me today saying the term full funding in the context of pooled reserves, and I want to emphasize I'm using the definition that comes from National Reserve Study Standards. Okay, these have been in place for a long time. Most people in Florida have a concept of fully funding, which is what I just showed you, hopefully what you now appreciate is called baseline funding. Now, to be clear, CAI adopted these national standards in 1998. That's 4 years before the state of Florida allowed pooled funding. I wish I would have been in the room when they did that to point to them and say, look, these definitions exist. Please be consistent with the existing terminology. Here we are 20-something years later, and we're trying to fight that fight now to get things to be called by their real names. But I want to be clear, when I'm talking to you about fully funding, the definition from these standards means setting the objective to attain and maintain reserves at or near 100% funded. So let's go back to that same table. This is the exact same association with the same starting position and the exact same expenses, but now we have a different funding goal in mind. Okay, instead of allowing it to get down to near zero, we want to try to attain and maintain reserves at or near 100%. Now that's okay for them to have some declines in here, right? They have this 1 year where they spend $2.2 million. But look, their low point is still hundreds of thousands in the bank, and they recover very quickly, back up to 100% funded within a very short period of time. So this is the difference, right? This reserve funding column, for a little bit more money, they avoid that very, dangerous, risky position of only having a couple $100 in the bank. It might look like this, right, on a different presentation. Okay, on this chart, I've got percent funded here on a 0 to 100% scale here, and I've got 30 years of the plan on my x-axis right here. So the orange dots in this example represent baseline funding, right? They come along here for about 10 years or so, but then they come very, very close to zero within these 3 to 4 year period and never get back on their feet. Fully funding, they continue at a little bit higher trajectory, still take a dip, but not anywhere as risky as down here. And they're back up to 100% very quickly. So what's the difference? Okay. Well, the baseline funding option, the orange, in our scenario, the initial year contribution was $102,400. The full funding is $127,500. So it's a difference about 25%. Okay. That's a much more sizable difference than we typically see. Most of the time, the dollar for dollar difference between baseline and full funding is more like 15 or 20%. But even this scenario, let's say it's 25%. The real dollar effect in this example for this association was about $15 per unit per month. Okay, $15 per unit per month was the difference between this and this. So less than $1 a day per unit was the difference between doing the riskiest possible thing and the safest, most responsible thing. Now, in either case, the purple dots here represent their existing plan, which we are clearly showing to them, if you keep on your same trajectory now, you will run out of money and be doomed to a life of special assessments. So if you're going to go to your owners and ask for more money, you might as well do it in the most responsible way possible, considering a fully funded reserve as your path forward. Okay, I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on this last option. I want to get to Q&A, but the third option here is called threshold funding. And the objective here is basically anything between baseline and full. Essentially, the way this works is you pick a target and then you design your funding plan accordingly. So the board here might say, okay, instead of becoming 100% funded, let's set our goal to be 70%. Or another way they might do is to set a floor, right? We want to make sure that we never go below $1 million in our pooled reserves. So what's wrong with this? Well, one of the problems with this approach is that I think it's introducing a lot more subjectivity. Okay, you can have one board in one fiscal year deciding that they want the threshold to be 50% funded. Next year, you've got a new board in place and they say, no, we have a different risk tolerance. We want the threshold to be 20%. Well, that can have a pretty big swing on the amount of money they're collecting from the owners, right? When we do these scenarios, it's usually kind of a unique client, and maybe we're just going through the motions with them to try to help them solve for themselves. But usually it's a lot better to just advocate for fully funding, right? In this case, your threshold is 100% funded rather than picking some arbitrary number in between. All right. So before we wrap this up, and I see a lot of questions already in the Q&A, we'll get to those as many as we can. I want to leave you guys with just a few parting thoughts. So if I've done any good here today, I'm hoping you'll agree that reserves are incredibly important for associations in the present and by extension in the future, right? If you're solving the problem in the present day, it won't exist in the future, okay? So when you're designing your annual budget, encouraging you to think hard and choose wisely about which method you're going to utilize to do that. Hopefully that's the pooled method. And I would say, hopefully once you've committed to the pooled method, make another smart choice about what the long-term objective of your funding plan should be. This hopefully goes without saying, but when you're crafting those budgets, the goal should never be to keep the dues low and keep the members happy, right? The goal is to take care of the association. Different people will come and go, right? Owners will come and go, boards will come and go, management companies will come and go. The buildings and the associations in theory exist in perpetuity. And so it is the stewardship and the responsibility of each person who's in charge along the way to keep that in mind. Okay, so as a person in a leadership position in the industry, whether you're a reserve specialist, or you're a property manager, you're a board member who's serving your community, it is your responsibility to try and educate the people around you to try to help them make wise financial decisions. And with that, I will put the last slide up here just to have my email address. And Ashley, if you're there, if you want to help me maybe start to go through the list of questions. And
Sure. Yep, let's go ahead and do that. And I did just go ahead and launch the poll. So if everyone can please take that, give us your feedback on how we did today, we would really appreciate that. Also, I will be emailing out the presentation, a link to the video recording of the webinar, Will's information, and then information on our future classes. So that will come out later today. And I will also be providing Will with the list of attendees. And if you are a property manager, you will be getting the CEUs for this, and will handle that. So yeah, we can go ahead and look at some of the Q&A. Do you want me to just go through from the very beginning then for these, Will?
Yeah, I'm looking at them now as well. Let's see. Yeah, I kind of want to go from the top down, but some of these may have been answered later in the material. So yeah, let's do as many as we can. I mean, we have about 20, 25 minutes. So, and again, just as I'd like to point out, I'm not an attorney. So this is not legal advice. Anything that I say, if you're not sure, you should probably check with your counsel, check with your property manager. I'm going to do my best. I have not seen any of these questions before, so some of them may be something I can't answer, right? If there's some very technical or specific question where I wouldn't know unless having done a reserve study for you or having a lot more information, I'm going to try to keep this broad and general and answer as many questions as I can that pertain to hopefully the most amount of people as possible. So yeah, so we can start at the top with
yeah.
John's.
Do you want me to read them to you, or do you want to go through?
Yeah, why don't you read them just so everyone can hear the question?
Yeah. I heard it is advisable, but may not be necessary to have separate reserve accounts for general reserves and structural reserves. With that said, my question is, WRT, my question is with pooling
with regard
reserves,
to,
if the accounts are not separated and both reserves are in one account, can the entire account be considered pooled and used accordingly for anything in those reserves?
Yeah, okay, so good question here. The person's asking specifically about a situation where it's a condo or a co-op that's subject to the structural integrity reserve study requirement. And so a lot of people may have a similar question here. To be clear, we call this the two pools concept, right? So nowadays in Florida, you can have one pooled reserve account for your structural reserves and a separate pooled reserve account for your general or your non-structural reserves. The restriction now is that you cannot use structural money to pay for a non-structural project, right? So the example that one of the legislators used was, we don't want people using money that was meant for the roof or for concrete restoration and using that to redecorate the lobby. Okay, so that's kind of the logical test. Now, within my pool of of structural reserves, I can still have roofing, painting, windows and doors, fire protection, plumbing, electrical, all of those new structural categories can be funded through one pool of funds, and I don't have to further break those down within that pool. Then on the other side of my planning, I've got my air conditioning, my parking lot, my swimming pool, my elevators, all my general or non-structural reserves, same thing. I just can't use money from structural for a non-structural project. So the pooled method is still allowed, but that is a new wrinkle to it, is that you have two pools of funds. So if you're in a scenario where you've historically had only one and you're looking to move to two, you can work with your reserve study company and they'll help you allocate how much should go into each one. Okay.
Perfect. Should I reserve for the 1.5 million insurance deductible?
Yeah, really common question. So the answer technically is yes. It is legal to do that, but I would advise you not to do it, because in order to list something as a reserve component, you have to assign it a useful life and a remaining useful life, right? So what is a reasonable expectation of how often this occurs and when is the next time it will occur? Now, we have no idea when you're going to have to pay your insurance deductible. So you're making a wild guess on both of those variables. So can you? Yes, but you're kind of taking a wild guess as to how you're going to fund it, right? If I assumed you had a $1.5 million deductible to pay 5 years from now, that's giving me one number. If I assume it's 2 years from now, that's a totally different number going into the budget to fund it. So we always tell people, yeah, we get it. It's a very large number. You want to start planning ahead for that. Totally appreciate why. But let's not do that as a reserve line item. Maybe handle that through your operating budget or a separate emergency fund or a line of credit or some combination of the two. But would advise you not to think of that first as a reserve component.
For condos under 3 stories, how are the target total amounts set for each reserve account, and how can should they be changed, updated?
Yeah, so condos under 3 stories, not subject to the structural integrity requirement. And I guess this answer applies to HOAs, and in a sense, it does still apply to all condos, even if you are 3 stories and above. The way you determine the amount of money that you need to have in reserves is by calculating the rate of deterioration, right? What I showed there in the beginning of the class. And then looking at how much money you have now, right? We use this term percent funded, which is showing us the cash on hand divided by this theoretical fully funded balance number. And that tells us how much money you should have at any point in time. So just real quickly, let's say you have a component that has a 10-year useful life and costs $10,000. Let's say it's 4 years old. Okay, so I would say 4 years out of 10, 4/10 times $10,000 means I should have $4,000 in the bank right now for the eventual replacement of this thing. And over the remaining years of its life, I'm going to continue to contribute towards that replacement. But you need to understand where you're starting from and what the future timeline looks like. And that's where, you know, either the board can do that themselves. If you've got a tool, a good spreadsheet, you can do that yourself, or that's what a reserve study provider will do for you.
Perfect. Is there any news about possible Florida legislative changes regarding reserve requirements?
Yeah, it depends what you mean by news, I guess. You know, there's nothing official that has changed at this point. There's a lot of discussion taking place amongst legislators, talking with folks like myself, you know, counterparts, competitors of ours, have appeared in Tallahassee to give presentations to talk about how this is actually hitting the marketplace. I know that the legislature was very curious to find out how many associations will have met the CERS and milestone inspection deadline by the end of 2024. The preliminary data that I've seen is that a fairly small percentage actually met that deadline. I'm going to guess at the end of the day, it might be something like 15 or 20% of condos that were supposed to do it actually got it done. So in terms of news, I think we'll know in the next couple of weeks, maybe if there's any lead up before the next session. But I think there has to be some consideration of extending that deadline or allowing a phase-in approach, maybe based on the ages of properties. Now, I'm speculating there. That's nothing official, but if I were to advise anybody who's actually the decision makers here, I would say the legislative intent is still sound. You want associations to be taking this seriously, but it was really impossible to try to get 20-something thousand condo associations to all do this in the space of like 18 months. So if I were to advise you guys on the call today, I would say if you are required to do a CERS and you haven't done it yet, you need to probably get on somebody's radar, you know, get a proposal for that, commit to a provider, get on their schedule, and get it done as soon as you can. That way, if there's any fallout from this, if there is any, you know, penalties or punishment that comes back around, you can say, look, we did our best. We contacted a bunch of providers. Everybody was already booked. We're on a schedule. We've paid a deposit. We are ready to do it as soon as we can. And that, I think, is going to have to be good enough. You know, the law says that the existing punishment is that if a board willfully and knowingly fails to meet the requirement, they're in breach of their fiduciary duty. Well, I don't think you're willfully or knowingly failing if you have made your best faith effort and there just wasn't any option. But it's a new year. I would say maybe try to start the process as early as you can.
All right. Are only certain financial institutions used to handle HOA reserve accounts? Can they just be deposited in any bank?
It's a good question. I don't know that there's any restriction about specific institutions. There are certainly banks that specialize working with community associations that are more well versed in the nuances of how they operate. So I would probably start there, but yeah, I've seen balance sheets with money held at, you know, everything from you know, credit unions to Bank of America to all, you know, all the big banks you see on TV. But I think there's definitely some advantages in looking at a bank or a financial institution that specifically works with community associations. You might find that they speak the language a little bit better.
All right. Is it mandatory for the board to include in the budget the contribution required for the CERS? Can they include partial information in the proposed budget?
Okay, leave that one on the screen for a moment if you all want to reread that. So is it mandatory for the board to include in the budget the contribution required for the CERS? To that, I would say yes. If you are required to do a CERS and you have had one done, then the proposed funding of reserves for those things must be based on your most recent structural integrity reserve study, right? You can't just disregard that or throw that away and come up with your own numbers. The second part, can you include partial information in the proposed budget? That's a little more difficult for me to answer. I guess I'd have to know what you mean by partial information. But if you have a contribution dollar amount, a number that was calculated for you, then I would say that's what needs to go into your budget.
All right. Does fully funded mean that the same amount has to be put into reserves each year? And is that specified in Florida statutes anywhere?
No, well, I would change the question to say, does fully funding mean that the same amount has to be put into reserves each year, right? So that's the ongoing contributions or the ongoing funding of reserves on an annual basis. And it is not and should not be the same amount each year. The reason for that is that inflation is happening all the time, right? So the cost of goods and services goes up. Your reserve contributions should be also increasing to keep up with that. So that is, I guess, specified in the statutes. That it does say that the proposed funding may take into account an annual inflation adjustment. And I think you should, right? So if you're contributing $100,000 this year, you should assume that something like 103, 104,000 next year is going to be the new number because the underlying costs of all those components will have increased by that amount.
All right. Can we borrow against our reserves to fund a project and return the funds at some time in the future via a special assessment?
That's a borderline legal and accounting question, so I'm gonna dance around it a little bit. I would say, well, I think technically yes, but I guess that opens up a whole can of worms. Yeah, what is the project you're talking about here? If it was something that was listed in your reserve schedule, then you're really not borrowing against your reserves. You're using your reserves for their intended purpose. If you're talking about something like, building a new pickleball court, right? Something that was totally outside of your reserve planning, and you want to borrow from reserve money to get that done in the short term and then pay it back with a special assessment, you'd probably have to consult your governing documents there. I would talk to an attorney about that. But the big, the overarching answer I would say is that reserve money is intended for specific purposes. And anytime you're using it for something outside of that, it's probably not a good idea, right? That money was put aside for a specific reason, and any dollar you take out of reserves, even if you plan to pay it back, what have you really accomplished? I would say in that scenario, you're better off just special assessing for the other project, right? The non-reserve thing, collect the special assessment for that and avoid the whole, borrowing from reserves in the first place.
All right, here's one. May we have both straight line and pooled reserve accounts in our association?
Again, technically, yes, but not really any advantage to doing that. I mean, you could, right? You could have a couple of straight line accounts that are specifically, protecting that money, if you will, for those particular things. It makes for a very complicated reserve planning process when you're doing two different calculations, right? We have one pooled analysis for everything that's in the pool, and then these straight line contribution calculations over here. To me, it's still advantageous to put everything in one pool of funds, put all of that money into one pot. That's going to make for a more efficient total usage of all that money.
What if there is no reserves? Can the board state at a meeting they are starting pooled reserves without the vote of the membership?
Again, possibly something to look into your governing documents and see why that would be the case. But if you've never had reserves, you need to start, all right? I mean, obviously these things exist. These expenses are inevitable. If you don't have any reserve funds, your only options are going to be loans and special assessments, which are usually not very welcome to the membership. So I would say, unless there's anything specifically saying that you can't have one, which I don't think I've ever heard of that being the case, then I would say, yeah, the board should decide and go forward and say, look, from now on, we're going to have reserves and we're going to make everybody pay this annual bill of deterioration together through the annual budget. And that's it. So,
yeah. And this is kind of a little bit of a follow-up to that. If you don't have we don't have a reserve fund in our HOA, how do we avoid missing a component in our reserve fund?
Yeah, so if you're going through this kind of exercise for the first time, there's a criteria that we use in our industry to define what is a reserve component so that nothing gets overlooked, right? And so as part of the fundamentals of reserves class, but real quickly, you're just going to effectively take a tour of the community, and a reserve study company would do this for you. But if you're doing it yourselves, you're looking for things that are meeting these criteria. It's the association's responsibility. It has a limited useful life. It has a predictable remaining useful life, and the cost of this thing is meaningful, right? And that's a different number maybe for different associations. Sometimes it's $1,000 and up, sometimes it's $10,000 and up. But anything and everything that is a physical element of the property that meets those 4 criteria is something you probably should consider as a reserve component. It's usually a much longer list than people realize. But that's one way to do it. Another is to go back through your historical spending. Where are we spending a bunch of money, and will that happen again? If so, I would say you probably want to dedicate a reserve component line item for that.
Mm-hmm. What rate of inflation do you use in reserve studies?
Our typical default is 3%. When you're projecting out into the future, it's going to vary. Obviously, there's years where inflation goes much higher than that. Other years where it's lower or flat. In some cases, things get less expensive over time, but you're looking for a singular number. I think our historical data trends in this country would support something like 3% as a good average, right? If you look out over a 30-year window of time and you look at the inflation rates from one year to the next, you average them out, something like 3% is going to be a pretty good predictor.
All right, if the association is still under developer control, can the developer approve changing from straight line to pooled reserves, or do you still need a resident vote?
Good question. I guess there may be something in the documents that would affect that, but to me, if the developer is the board, they are acting in the capacity of the board in that case, just like a volunteer board would later on. They should be able to create a new pooled reserve account. And the only thing that may require a vote of the members would be taking money from existing straight line accounts to put into that pool. I don't see, to me, a meaningful difference between a developer controlled board and an owner controlled board in that context. But again, that's maybe a legal question, something that could be specific to your scenario.
All right, let me look here. Let's see. How often should we do a reserve study? We just installed a new tile roof. What should we use for useful life?
Okay. Well, I'll answer the second question first. So a tile roof in South Florida, usually you're going to figure, hopefully, minimum of 15 to 20 years. 25 years for a long time has been our kind of default life expectancy for a well-installed, well-maintained tile roof. Your insurance company may have something to say about that. These days, a lot of insurance companies are restricting coverage or dropping policies based on the ages of roofs. So I would put in a call to your insurance carrier and say, look, is there some number that you guys have determined that this is the end date for our roof and we're going to have to replace it or at risk of dropping our policy? And so that may be 20 years. So something like that, 20, 25 years, let's say. As far as how often to do a reserve study, the best practice in our industry for a long time has been about every 3 years to do a fresh on-site physical analysis. The new requirements for the SIRS, for the structural integrity study, is specifically at least once every 10 years. That's not often enough. Okay, you need to be doing this much more frequently than that, just to account for all the changes in the physical condition of the property, the amount of money you have on hand, and so forth. But something like every 3 years to do a fresh on-site evaluation. And then in the off years between those, you can do a very quick and easy, what we call a no site visit update if you want to. That's where the provider will just run through the numbers, fine tune it for you, send you a new calculation for that particular fiscal year. But something like every 3 years, it's, that's your physical checkup. This is kind of recommended.
Perfect. A condo was turned over in 2024. When does the first SIRS report need to be done?
Good question. Well, the initial deadline was December 31st, 2024, but for a new condo that may be extended, I honestly don't know the answer to that. I guess the short answer is as soon as possible. And that answer is true whether it's a SIRS or not. I mean, anytime you have a building that is new and getting its initial budgeting practices in place, to do a reserve study very early is the best way to get on the right track from day one, right? If you wait 3 years, 5 years, 10 years, and you're just going off of the developer's initial budget, you're probably going to find that that was insufficient. And so the earlier you can course correct to what a real number should be, that's going to be to your advantage. But as far as the legal requirement for CERS, I'm not sure off the top of my head there.
Can reserves be collected at the same time as the HOA dues as long as we separate the reserve portion collected and keep it in a separate account? This would make it easier on the owners to make just one payment per month for both the monthly association fees and the reserves.
Yeah, that's exactly how it should be done, right? So your owners should be writing one check, and then the board transfers the portion of that money to the reserve account. I think it has to be done within 30 days of receipt. So if you have monthly dues, your owners write a check for, $250 per month. If you've determined $50 of that 250 is going to the reserve account, you take all that money that's collected and the reserve portion gets transferred to that account. So you don't have to have owners writing one check for operating, one for reserves.
Who is allowed to add reserve line items, and what is the procedure to do it?
To my knowledge, well, the board is responsible for creating the budget. So the answer is always the board of directors there. And they should do it as soon as they've identified the need for that, right? If you just have always historically budgeted for something, or I should say, overlooked something, let's say it's an irrigation system, right? You always just, we just figured the sprinklers went on and the grass is green. But your vendors now come to you and say, actually, your pump system is dying and it's going to cost you 50 grand to replace. Boy, that catches us by surprise. But as soon as you know that, you should add that as a new reserve component and plan accordingly. And then, the initial cost might sting a bit, but from then on, you will be funding for future cycles of that work so that hopefully you won't get caught by surprise again.
Do you have
probably have time for like one or two more, and then I've got a
okay.
hard.
Oh yeah. Oh, that's right. You said 115.
That's
Sorry.
okay.
Yes. All right. I'm seeing here. What is the average cost of a reserve study? I think that really depends, right?
It can vary pretty wildly. It's typically for a. Well, yeah, it depends. Based on, is it an HOA? Is it a condo? Where is it located? How old is it? I mean, on average, you're talking thousands of dollars, not hundreds of dollars, but not tens of thousands of dollars. It's usually a function of, just how complex the property is, what time of year is it even. On average, I would say, and this is a very broad average, plus or minus $5,000. If you've never had one done before and we're doing everything totally from scratch, right? If you've had one done and you're just doing an update to that study, then that number should drop significantly, right? The cost of updating an existing study is much less than doing one from scratch. So the best way to find that out is just get some proposals. If you go to our website, reservestudy.com, up in the top right of our homepage, there's a button that says request a proposal. You click on that. We'll get you an answer within a couple of days usually. And I'm sure other companies can do similar. And then you'll know from there what's a ballpark figure.
Perfect. Do you have or know of an Excel template for projecting the reserve funding out to 30 years that the associations can use?
Yeah, absolutely. There's a bunch of options out there. We have one that we've developed, which is called UPlanet. And that exists for our clients to be able to test out different funding plan scenarios, but it's also something where you can upload your own spreadsheet into it, and it will present you with a dashboard of options for how to model different funding scenarios, testing out different variables. I know there's other companies, reserve study companies, that have developed their own kind of proprietary solutions there. There's off-the-shelf things you can buy online. But yeah, there's a lot of options out there that will enable you to build out those 30-year projections.
Perfect. So that was one or two more questions. So that was two.
Yeah, appreciate it. And I have to apologize. I know there's dozens of questions still open. I really appreciate everybody's interest. What I can try to do is Ashley, if you want to maybe send me these, I can try to read through them. Maybe we'll do a follow-up. I would love to do another webinar with you guys, maybe in a couple of months, where we circle back to some of these things. A lot of these questions are about CERS. And, we'll have more to say on that probably in the next 2 to 3 months once the session is underway. So stay tuned, everybody. Hopefully we'll be able to answer those then.
Yeah, that sounds great. I can definitely share these with you also. And I love the idea of doing follow-up webinar. We're always good for that. So just to reiterate, as I mentioned earlier, I did launch that poll. Please go ahead and take that for us. We really appreciate it. Give us your honest feedback. We're always looking to improve these, see what we did right, what we could do better. Also, I will be emailing out the presentation, the link to this video recording, so you will get this video recording, Will's contact information, and then all of the information on our future classes. I also did see in the Q&A asking about certificates for board members and why don't board members get CEU credits for this. It's because, as I mentioned at the beginning, the DBPR hasn't offered any guidance for the CEU courses. So there's no providers or vendors who are offering CEUs for board members yet. Once the DBPR does offer guidance and we do have courses, we will most definitely be offering those. But for right now, I will just be sharing the attendee list with Will. That includes the property managers, and those will be the ones who will get the CEUs for right now. And I think that's everything. Thank you everyone for joining us. Thank you, Will, so much. We really, really appreciate it. And I'll leave this open for a little bit longer for the poll, so if anybody still needs to take that. Otherwise, we will see everyone at our next webinar. Thanks again, Will. Thanks, everyone.
See you next time. Thanks so much. Bye.
Thanks for watching. For more great educational content, click the subscribe button now.